The 6 members of the Station Philosophers Club meet irregularly at the brasserie at the Gare Saint-Jean in Bordeaux. Otto from Hamburg is their provocateur. He lives on a boat in the Bassin à Flot and is always spoiling for a fight. Alice, a yoga teacher from Geneva, comes in by bicycle from her home in Le Bouscat. Gwen and Steph arrive by train from Bergerac. Sean trains as a priest before joining the Irish Army and serving in Bosnia. He lives in Belsier, just across from the station. That just leaves William, a translator, who at this moment is waking up to a smell of burning. 3 days previously, something extraordinary happened to him. William puts on his glasses and sits up. A moment later he gets out of bed and walks quickly into the kitchen in case he has left a pan on the stove overnight, but there is nothing sizzling away there. He walks back into the bedroom and steps out onto the small balcony. When he looks to his right, he sees the smoke haze hanging over the city to the south. The forest fires have started up again. Last week they left an acrid smell that lingered over the city for days. Acres of forest down by the shore were burning. There were pictures in the newspapers of people in swimsuits standing on the beach, staring up at the thick black smoke. William looked down at the thin film of dust on the table on the balcony. He rubbed his finger through the dust and held it up to his nose. Not too good if you have all that in your lungs. At the previous meeting of the Station Philosophers Club, Otto had attacked Alex, the brasserie waiter. It was an afternoon when they all ordered coffees, with the exception of Otto, who had called for a beer, saying it was thirsty work walking along the quays in this heat. Sean then promptly asked Alex to bring a small cognac to go with his coffee. When, 5 minutes later, Alex set the drinks down on the table, he said he had an unusual story he would like to recount to the philosophers if they had the time. The philosophers said they would be happy to hear his story, and because it was a quiet afternoon, a place was made at the table for him. While many waiters today are indistinguishable from their customers, anyone seeing Alex off duty, even without his money belt and his green apron, would look at his red face and curly hair and his small burly build and make a good guess as to how he earned his living. Alex told the philosophers that as a young man with ambitions, though he did not say what the ambitions were, he had emigrated to Canada, living first in Quebec City, then in Montreal, where he had a job with a local company, though again he did not say what the company was. He lived in a small apartment on Rue Saint-Denis. When he looked back, he realized it had been the best time of his life. He had made a lot of friends, and for a long time he regretted returning to France. One day, a month ago, as he was getting ready to come on shift at the station brasserie at the Gare Saint-Jean, he had caught a news item on the radio, and the presenter was having a good laugh about it. There was a restaurant in Montreal. It had a reputation as the best in the city. It had hundreds of glowing reviews. However, local journalists had become suspicious, and none of them had ever eaten there. So they went to the address and found, of course, that the restaurant didn't exist. They were still trying to discover if it was a fraud or just a student prank. "When I checked the address," Alex said, his voice surprisingly soft for a man in his position, "I found it was next door to the apartment I had lived in a dozen years previously." He stopped and looked at the philosophers as if to ask their opinion on such a strange coincidence. It was Otto who spoke up. "Alex, do you really mean to tell us that living next door to a restaurant that never existed has been the high point of your life so far?" This brought a snigger from Steph. Behind his waiter's front, Alex was actually a self-conscious soul, and the other philosophers could see that he was disheartened by this reaction. As a result, before departing, they made sure that Otto left a substantial tip. Later, Alex told them He had actually been taking philosophy courses at night school in Montreal when he had been forced to return to Bordeaux and take up this waiter's job at the Brasserie due to a family crisis. Then, he went on, a few weeks ago a relative died and left him a small legacy. It was enough, he said, to enable him to give up his job at the station and return full-time to his philosophy studies at the university. A short while later, Alex was invited to become a member of the Station Philosopher Club, where he was always happy to advise if a philosophical point was ever raised. He was the only one in the group who had any training in philosophy. And later he told a story of an incident at the station that put Otto firmly in his place. Otto's tendency to offend, and only to realize what he had done when it was explained to him, made the philosophers wonder if he had some sort of a syndrome, perhaps similar to Tourette's. In the bathroom, William examined his face in the mirror. He would be 30 in 2 weeks. He thought he was probably aging at a normal rate, but there were times when his thick curly hair seemed to be receding at an alarming speed. If that continued, in a few years his forehead would certainly be far too prominent. He leaned forward until his face was almost touching the mirror. He muttered to himself, "What happens after 50 anyway? Teeth gone, hair gone, sexual capacity reduced to zero, capacity for alcohol also seriously diminished." He stepped back from the mirror, grunted, brushed his teeth, slapped water on his face, replaced his glasses, and going into the bedroom put on jeans and t-shirt. When he was dressed, he frowned. There was a word he hadn't known. Someone had used it during the night. Because the stations were so close together, if he turned in his sleep and nudged the radio, it could easily change from one station to another. He padded barefoot into the kitchen to put the water on for coffee and to see if there was any bread. He was sure it was the journalist from Quebec. She had said something like, "Là où il y a de l'homme, il y a de l'hommerie." There was no bread. Damn. He translated the phrase in his head. Men are always flawed? No, not strong enough. Perhaps better as, where there are men there is corruption. Well, it certainly applied to Quebec gangsters, but it was not particularly hopeful about the human condition overall. William didn't agree with it. Despite the worries over his receding hairline, William was an optimist. He thought the world was really a good place. With the exception of Otto, he was sure the philosophers would agree with him. He slipped into his sandals and, picking up his keys, walked out of the door and down the stone staircase. The air was still pleasantly cool in the corridor. It would heat up later on. He pulled back the front door and stepped out into the street. Turning to the right, he thought the haze from the forest fires was a little thicker. It wasn't an unpleasant smell. It made William think of an autumn bonfire. He turned left and then right onto Rue Judaïque, and being careful to avoid the dog mess on the pavement, walked past the tobacco and entered the Patisserie Royale. He said good morning to the Indian lady behind the counter, at the same time nodding to the Labrador at her heel. He ordered 2 croissants. Normally he bought just one, but it was a Saturday, and when he had examined himself in the mirror, he thought he looked a little peaky. There were several other people waiting behind him, so it was not a moment for chit-chat. He thanked the Indian lady, walked out of the shop, turned left, and a couple of minutes later was back in his building. Clara Chong, who had the apartment on the floor above him, was coming down the stairs. William was in love with Clara Chong, but for the moment he was too shy to declare his passion. "Good morning, William," she said. The enticing voice and the open smile made William's heart flutter. "It's Saturday. Are you going back to the market?" William knew that he ought to. He sighed. "Not today, Clara. I've got too much work on, and there's a deadline coming up." Clara looked surprised. "But after everything that happened last week?" You were going to go back. You told me you wanted to solve the mystery. It's the most incredible story I ever heard, and you have to go today, otherwise it won't work. Anyhow, what have you got there? Croissants. Do you want one? They're still warm. Clara hesitated and took one with a smile and stood on the step above him, nibbling at it. I'm rushing for a class at the moment, but I've left a note under your door. William's heart quickened a little more. I've got tickets for a concert tonight. I thought we could go together. William thought his heart would burst with pleasure. Clara finished her croissant. You know, you really should go back and retrace your steps. It would be crazy not to. She glanced at her watch. Hey, I've got to fly. Then she was brushing past William and turning into the corridor. As William climbed the steps back to the apartment, he knew she was right. He entered the apartment and picked up the envelope she had pushed under the door and cleared a space at the table. He made himself a coffee, began to eat the croissant, at the same time opening the envelope and taking out the note. Clara was studying at the conservatoire, so on occasion she got complimentary tickets for concerts. This one was for 8 o'clock this evening. He read the detail, a Schubert sonata and something else. He put the note to one side. A friend of his mother's had once asked him about his musical tastes, and to tease her, he said he'd enjoyed the music they played in the supermarket. He said he would stand under the speaker in the coffee aisle or the pasta aisle so that he could listen to an ABBA song. But if he was going to make an impression on Clara Chong, as well as getting a haircut and buying new clothes, he would have to brush up on his classical music. This afternoon he would find the Schubert sonata on the internet and listen to it before the concert. William finished the croissant, and looking at the unfinished translation on the other side of the table, which in turn looked accusingly back at him, he sighed and pulled a face. The deadline was approaching, and he needed the money. Do a good job on this, the lady at the agency had said, and the other jobs would follow. That's the way it worked. He finished his coffee and took his plate and his cup to the sink. He hesitated, moved from foot to foot, squinted, looked at the wine bottle sitting on the table in front of him. In the morning light, its glittering appendage dazzled. Clara's right, he said out loud. It would be crazy not to go back to the market today. Today is Saturday, and Saturday is the weekend, and who the hell works at the weekend anyway? In 5 minutes he had gone through cupboards and fridge and made an inventory, not forgetting to add almonds to the list. He hesitated. Should he ask Clara for supper after the concert? No, she would have eaten already. Better to suggest a drink. It would be a way of thanking her. William had not been in Clara's apartment, though he was certain she kept it neat and tidy. He could hear when she was vacuuming. William pulled the shutters to. If he didn't, the sun would be pouring in, and the heat would be intolerable when he returned. Finally he was ready. Bag for the shopping over his shoulder, straw hat, midnight blue in colour, plonked on his head, sunglasses, keys. He waited until France Info announced the news was next. He checked his watch. It was important to leave the apartment at the same time as last week. Stepping out onto the landing, he locked the door behind him, went down the stairs, turned into the corridor, and stepped out onto the street. Instead of turning left, this time he turned to his right.